Yeah, we're ready.
So, hey everyone, let's start up. It's a workshop, so we don't have to do anything formal. Just in terms of who's here, I see 5 council members in person. Ren called in and is excused, and then I see Paloma online. I see Chris White, the city administrator, in person, and I see, well, I think I see the city attorney online.
Yes, Nick is here.
All right. Okay. So first thing we want to do tonight is the survey on recreation and community facilities, and I'm going to turn it over to Mark Price. Thank you. You're going to introduce Dan Biggs?
I am.
Okay.
Good evening, everyone. So we're here tonight. We have our final report for the community facility and program report. If you remember last year's budgeting process, we set aside some money for some consulting to do a community survey and inventory of current conditions and places to do things, and you know, finalize that with a report that, you know, sort of gives us some tools to look ahead to the future. So in March of 2022, we selected Weston and Sampson as our consultant for this project and got right to work after that. In the months following, we were able to map and inventory our current programs and facilities here in Beacon. You know, beyond that, we took on a community survey and did our best to reach all of Beacon. You know, and I think we had just under 1,000 surveys, which I was pretty proud to get to that point. It would have been great to have more, but it was a good stopping point. We took those tools, and Weston and Sampson, you know, looked at national trends and basically created this report, which we have to you tonight in almost final draft. So, you know, but Dan's going to walk us through sort of the highlights or sort of bigger points of it. I will tell you, it was with the help of our community, anyone that you know, I sort of partner with in recreation programs and community programs that help get the word out about the survey and sort of help us, you know, compile the list of current, you know, conditions and places and programs. So I thank the community for their support and helping us get there, and I think you'll find it's a pretty good report. It's thorough. It sort of speaks to the landscape currently in Beacon as far as programs and places to hold programs, and you know, gives us some recommendations moving forward based on national standards and what the community said. You know, that was the biggest overlay in this, is what our community was looking for moving ahead in the future. And I think that's all I really have currently. I will introduce Dan Biggs with Weston and Sampson, and it was he and his team that put this together for us.
Thank you, Mark. Good evening, members of the council and mayor. I think we're having a presentation coming on here. Ben, when you're ready. Well, thank you for having me back. It's been, hasn't been a full year, but it seemed like a full year. We've done a lot of work in this project, and tonight I'm going to summarize what our findings were, but first give you some background as to how we got to the solutions recommendations on this project. Ben, next slide. Next slide again. So our process, as I explained a couple months ago, we really started with a kickoff meeting, looking at what is in the community right now from a programs and facilities standpoint. As Mark mentioned, we reach out to the public, and I'll cover through some of the needs assessments and the survey data that we had. Also looking at what is a demographic, what is the community made out of. That really informs us as to what do you want to look forward for now and into the future for your programs and facilities. We had a fairly thorough public outreach process, which I'll share the results of that. And that really came back to develop what recommendations are in our draft master plan, and finally we're here tonight to talk about the final master plan in almost draft or almost complete format. Next slide, please. So the master plan really is the process we went through of the multiple chapters. I won't reiterate these again, but really step by step really goes through the process we went through, looking as to where you are now and where you can go to the future. A number of the appendices have the backup as to the presentations that we gave here to you a couple months ago, as well as a survey summary from our online survey and the data received for any backup that you're looking for. And finally, the working documents from Mark and his team to look at what we inventoried in the field. So as you make improvements moving forward, Mark can go back, do the same inventory that we did to mark as to where improvements are made. It really uses as a working document to move forward to make improvements to the city's facilities and programs. And finally, we have a couple concept plans for each of the park facilities. That's a guide from Mark and his team as to where improvements can be made, and more specifics to as he's moving forward in the planning and design process. Next slide. So first, we want to cover a little bit about the demographics. I'm not going to go into too much of the details here. But as we were looking over Beacon and who is Beacon, some of the data we found was that you can see on the right-hand side of the screen, a majority of the population is between 20 and 60 years old. That's probably not too much of a surprise, but those spikes in the middle of the graph really shows as to who is here now and who's going to be here for the future. So how do we plan and program for these users to want to use more Beacon's facilities and have the right programs in line for the needs of the community? Within our survey, we had about 60% of Caucasian responses and 26% Hispanic, with the others in between. With that, that's good data to know as to who actually responded. So if we do a survey again and we have know who we're reaching out to, we can compare this to see, are we reaching out to more population? Are the numbers going to change? But really, it's a standing point for Mark and his team to know how do we do in this process and how can we do better in the future. Next slide, please. We look back also as to how is Beacon doing in terms of population. Is it growing? Is it shrinking? As you can see here, from 2000 to 2020, the compound annual growth was about 0.02%. But from 2020 to 2022, we actually had an increase of 0.37%. We compared this back to some of your other data from your other studies. It's fairly comparable, so that's a good gauge just to know we're on the right path, and the numbers that we're using for this study really are true to what you're also using within the city of Beacon. And by 2035, estimated population is around 15,000 persons, plus or minus. Next slide. We looked at Mark and the department's funding. Really looking at the trends and looking back at 2015 data all the way through 2022. And from that, you can see that the budget has nearly tripled over the course of this time period. That is pretty significant to note that while you have had investment, we'll see that the program numbers and the users have really increased throughout this duration. There's a little blip in there for that COVID factor 2020. We see that fairly as an anomaly in your numbers, but fairly flat. But again, looking back as to how you're currently seeing enrollment, your numbers for the after-school program are significant, and it's about 60% of your total revenue for the department's funding. Next slide, please. So looking at public engagement, we had a multi-pronged approach. We first started off in early July, which I think several members of the council were a part of, to really reach out and have focus group meetings. This was a chance for us to reach out and have conversations, hear about specifics within the community that informed us on how we should present our public engagement process and develop our online survey. From that point forward, Mark reached out to several contacts within the community to really have a public outreach process using your local sports and recreation groups, your other community societies and associations to really reach out to and have a contact in the field to share their survey. So throughout the summer, there was stands set up at the Spirit Beacon Day, all the way down to the farmers market, Halloween party, just having a table where people could continue to give feedback as to the online survey. As Mark mentioned, we had over 900 total responses, just under 1,000. And some of the stats that we had from the survey were the average residency was 15 years, which is pretty significant for most of the surveys that we see. 73% of responses owned their own home. Most of the responses was pretty equal throughout the 4 wards, which is good to see. Over half identified as female. Over half had couples with a child, so average household around 3 persons. I mentioned 74% identified as white or Caucasian, and over half of those that responded visit the facility once a week, which is good to hear, so that we were actually getting responses from people that are using facilities and programs, so that their input really is valued as we move forward in this process. Next slide, please. Some things that we noticed in the overall summary from the public engagement process. Most acknowledged that the parks were in a good shape, especially given the limited operations and maintenance staffing and funding. And that's a general perception that we heard from the public. Almost 80% believe that the overall park ratings were satisfactory or above. 70% of responses said that there was a need for a new or expanded community center. Just over half preferred a central community location, and teenagers and children were the demographic that most felt that that could best serve. As you see on the right-hand side of the screen, we have a word cloud here as to some of the words that were given, responses given to what programs or activities do you or your household typically engage in the City of Beacon parks and recreation facilities. And the larger the word was, the more frequent that word was responded to. So you can see hiking, playgrounds, walking, soccer, swimming, picnics, running, and down the list. So a pretty good response in terms of the variety that we were hearing from how users are using Beacon's parks. Next slide. Some of the other input that we got, in summary, we asked users to give us a level of importance for the facilities and programs that they use, and what would they want to see moving forward into the next decade. So the top 3 facilities in order of importance were open space and natural spaces, community neighborhood parks, and trails and pathways. If you think about that, that kind of includes everything that you have within the city. But some of the top 3 items that were desired to be addressed, one was to expand community programs and activities, develop a new community recreation center or centers, and preserve open space and land acquisition. The top 3 facilities to improve and expand, trails and pathways, additional improvements to restrooms came up often, as well as a new community center. We also asked about facilities. In addition, we asked about programs. So the top 3 programs to provide expand, one was environmental education nature programs, music and art in the parks, and as well as programs for teenagers. We asked users as to what are the top 3 programs to increase engagement, just in terms of how can get better access to users or potential users of facilities. Most said that improved condition of facilities was a top need to improve engagement within the recreation programs and facilities. Many asked to have improved communication, and finally adding more programs and events. And these last 2 are fairly open-ended, because if you look at some of the stats about communication, many said that they believe there was good communication. So not everyone is always going to be happy about communication in terms of parks and recreation. Some prefer online, some want paper, some want just more. Many say that they get communication in their emails all the time. So it's a balance. There's no happy medium in there, but ongoing communication really is a strategy moving forward. We asked for the top 3 communication methods. No surprise, many use the city website. Social media is high on the list, as well as emails. So those 3 mechanisms we suggest moving forward, continuing at the program's doing, recreation program's doing, to reach out to the public for current and future users. Next slide. We looked at the trends of users within Beacon's recreation programs. The graph on the bottom, you see just the growth over the last several years since 2018. You've more than doubled registrations simply within the last year. That's impressive as a program. I think that I'm squinting by about 2,100 users in 2022, and the last I heard that you have full enrollment in your current programs. And there's a need for more programs and possibly more staffing to support that moving forward. Finally, looking at the stats on the right-hand side of the top graph, we looked at registrations and how they compare to the different age breakdowns. You can see that the users from 0 to 10 have 9.4%, and increase all the way up to 13% for 31 to 40-year-olds. So looking at the stats, more than half of your users are 0 to 10 age demographic, which is about 9.4% of your current population. Looking at that, there's opportunities that you could possibly get more youth into your programs as you move forward with additional programming. Next slide. We assess, again, the recreation programs, just looking at satisfaction. How do people, or what's their beliefs on the programs and what's offered? As you can see in the upper left-hand corner, outstanding and satisfactory were very high, with 23.76% of prospective users say there's needs for improvement. So overall, the programs offered are very well received. You can see on the top right-hand side, the satisfaction number of recreation programs offered. Many believe that should be more programs offered, but it's pretty close to balance overall with how the program currently are offered within the city. And the graph on the bottom, we asked, how satisfied are you with, I shouldn't say area, I should say, are you with events you and your household have attended or participated? And you can see the majority there are satisfactory or better. How satisfied are you with classes or activities? Again, similar metrics. For over 50% of users believe that they have used classes within the last 2 years and very satisfied. And finally, clubs or leagues within the household within the last 2 years. Again, over a majority of users are satisfied with the current program offerings. Next slide. So finally, we asked, what are areas to improve the recreation service delivery within the city? The top responses got are over 30% of responses. The first is condition and maintenance of parks and community facilities. This is not really too much of a surprise. It's a pretty common trend, especially when you have an older city with some dated facilities. Next, improved communication about offerings, 35%. Lighting within parks, more community facilities and amenities, and more community programs. So we're starting to see a trend here with many want more communication or better communication, as well as new facilities that may be dated and more programs, which basically is framing up for recommendations here in the next step. Next slide. We went and looked at all your facilities as well. And some of the overview of program recommendations that we believe. One is to expand your current special event programming. We heard there's a need for specific programs for users or for user groups. We suggest reviewing your current program offerings and just annually. So although you may have a club or a program that's been offered for many years, it's always good to revisit that to see, are you getting the same performance or same registrations as you had historically? Is there anomalies that you may want to adjust that and direct your staff to better use of resources? We're often hearing that access to athletic fields for existing and new user groups is a common trend. So for example, if there's a rugby need or flag football, they may not feel or believe that they have proper access to a historically used soccer field or football field. So you may want to just look at that and reassess that with different leagues and different clubs to make sure there's equal access to different facility uses by new and growing programs. And finally, look at communication and funding for maintenance. As you look through your budgeting process, maintenance is really important because that's one of the first things that users will comment on. And note, if the bathroom doesn't appear as to up to standard quality, that's the first thing that Mark and his team will usually hear about. Next slide. So when we looked at the facilities, we looked at all of them, gave every single facility component a recommendation or a rating. To highlight the strengths of your facilities, you have a highly utilized park system, many users out there of all different users' needs and wants. You have a variety of passive and active facilities, meaning you have active sports fields all the way down to walking passive trails or simply places to picnic in the lawn. Your facilities for a wide variety of age ranges in interest, which is great. There is a need for maintenance and implementation of improvement projects. So you have a couple projects that you have already designed in your pockets, that those are strengths that you can bring those forward when the funding is available. And you have great partnerships with public and private providers. We reached out to other providers within the community. The school district had great things to say about engagement with the recreation department and that relationship. And that's really a strength moving forward, so that you all don't take the burden on all the program needs, but really work with your partners to implement those within the city. With every project, there's needs for improvements. I mentioned a lot of maintenance and upgrades, specifically ADA accessibility. Many of your playgrounds could use some improvements. There's some specific drainage issues in some parks, just simply haven't maintained or just have seen better decades of use. Signage and wayfinding was a common need, just a note as to what the park names were or where you could get to from and within the parks. Several parking areas need some improvement, as well as lighting within some of the parks. There was a note to there's a lack of connection between some of your park facilities or within different resources within parks. And finally, community participation. There's a possibility of having more public engagement to make improvements to your park with other groups, other associations, so the burden is all on the city to make all those improvements at once. Next slide. So in general terms, for all the report that we noted, a couple of high-level recommendations that we have for the city. The first is there's a high need for a community center within the city. We recommend the next steps to take to develop a feasibility study to assess as to what does that look like, what programs can be met within one common facility, where's the best place for it. We believe that there's need to implement and update ADA transition plan, so meeting current federal guidelines moving forward, assessing as to where should you really be improving facilities to meet the current federal standards. There's always an idea as to maintaining facilities, but we want to acknowledge that not every facility needs the same level of maintenance. For example, you may have lawns throughout the city. You may have the idea of a nice manicured cut lawn, but that manicured cut lawn doesn't have to happen everywhere. There could be other areas that are naturalized, as in only mowed every third mowing period, versus every mowing once a week for your nice turf fields. So identifying those locations can also be a cost savings as to where do you save on your maintenance needs of certain areas within the city while still maintaining nice, aesthetically pleasing and useful park facilities. A part of this is to develop a plan for each of your park spaces, so noting as to where should improvements specifically be needed, where do you want to have those no-mow zones, for example, or restriping for a new sport. Improving as to growing and preserving open spaces within the city. Improve and upgrade existing facilities and outdated amenities that no longer meet the needs of Beacon. For example, an old playground that may have a teeter-totter and some benches really doesn't get a lot of use. It's just as well that those should be removed, and you can have a consolidated space for a new playground that's accessible and visible within the roadway for users to use. Expanding the walking paths and trails to improve connectivity and update signs and maps. So really having your trail network thought of as a connection within parks and communities and neighborhoods, and making those access points useful so users don't have to necessarily drive to every park if they want to enjoy a playground, enjoy tennis courts, etc. And finally, expand the use of the school district facilities and partnerships with other user groups within the city to expand that and embrace as to what you're already doing, but as much as possible, share the need and experience and the expertise of others within the city to expand Beacon's recreation programs. So that's all I have. Ben, next slide. I think this is a lot older. So those general recommendations, in the report you'll see, I wanted to highlight that we looked at every park facility. We give recommendations of a time frame, so those are near-term versus long-term needs, or those are just simply ongoing maintenance requirements. And then we classified each of the recommendations as to what is simply a compliance or maintenance need, what could be upgrade, and what could be comprehensive reconstruction for a park facility. Next slide. Some concluding thoughts. As you can see, the investment within the recreation program is significant, and it has seen nearly 3 times the budget within the last several years, which is impressive. The parks are well maintained with what funding, what staffing you currently have, but obviously there's room for improvement in ways to grow that moving forward. By improving your outdated facilities and improving facilities that users see on a regular basis. Accessibility, tree planting, improved signage are all recommended moving forward. Really suggest having that partnership with local organizations really is critical for meeting the needs of programs and users within the various spaces. Finally, strengthening community connections between regional facilities are important, and having that central community center really will meet the needs that we heard throughout the whole process of many residents, particularly youth and children within the city of Beacon. That's all I have. Thank you for tonight. Any questions if you had a chance to review? If not, we can certainly take questions afterwards or comments that can come in through Chris and Mark as you get a chance to review.
Yeah, so thanks for doing this. I'll just open it up to questions. Just to let you know that I read the slides, the 2 budget numbers is more than triple, not nearly triple. I think it's 305%. So, but I appreciate it. Looks like there's a lot of good information there. I'm still digesting it. But let me open it up to council for questions.
And just a quick note, Molly flagged that one of the charts was kind of inverted where the positives were negative and the negatives were positive, and we'll be fixing that. So thank you for flagging that. And any other, this is an advanced draft, but it's not final. So if you find anything else like that, please just let Mark and me know.
I saw a similar potential oddity in the numbers in section 2.6 under the accessibility in terms of our statistics on people living with disabilities. It looks like our 13.4 is actually above the state average of 11.6. Am I reading that correctly?
I'll have to check. I don't recall offhand, but we'll definitely look at that value.
Yeah, I mean, I think the conclusion that you presented to us remains the same, that we should implement and update an ADA transition plan, which I think would be great.
I had a question about what's the expectation for, or what's a good ratio of open space to the number of people, and how are we doing with that number, and how would we be doing with that number in 2035, if you know?
So historically, that statistics would be what most communities would use. The trend has been going away from actual square footage or acreage per thousands of persons, for the reason that there's acknowledgement in most of our cities, some of the urban spaces are more critical and more valuable than simply that population ratio. But I can say from comparing you to other communities that we work in, you have a good variety. Location-wise, locations of parks in the city are pretty good. But it's really, as you heard from the public engagement, meeting the needs of the users want to see a little more variety. Definitely the care for what's there in the city core really is that to make those high valuable spaces goes back to maintenance and ongoing improvements. So users that come to use the bathrooms, for example, they want to have a place that's, say, comfortable to use the restrooms, right? The minute that they're perceived as aged, outdated, and not going to be functioning to their needs, their level of satisfaction declines, so then their care may decline as well, if you know what I mean. So having sometimes smaller spaces is even better in urban spaces because they provide so much green space or variety value that you may not have otherwise.
Right. Okay, thanks.
And Dan, if I might add, when we discussed that issue with Mark and Dan, one of the things to keep in mind is we adjoin a 6,000-acre Hudson Highland Park. So the issue isn't so much as, do you have that space, as how do people access it? How do we invite them to access that and support that? The other thing is we're working on that rail trail, which didn't make it into the report, but the county has decided to move forward on a study of the Beacon Hopewell Rail Trail. Cool. And that 9-mile linear park opens up a lot of other alternatives for biking, running, walking.
It goes back to that point of having those connections so users can walk out down a sidewalk, down a trail to get to a park, recreate, eat, whatever they want to do, and go back home safely. That's such a great quality of life component to have within the city.
And they did find that environmental education was one of the programs people wanted to focus on. So there's a lot of potential here.
The other thing, and you looked up the mountain, but if you look the other way to the river, we've managed to keep our riverfront non-developed. And both, starting at Dennings Point State Park, then the trail up to Long Dock acquired by Scenic Hudson. We maintain the Seeger Park. Our zoning on the river side of the train kind of keeps it that way, and the way we'll support it is we'll develop around the train station. So we're kind of surrounded, which is cool. When I think about the question you asked, which is what's the right number, it really is a function. There isn't because think about New York City, that would be a really different number than ours. I don't know quite the answer, but I think we've got some interesting resources.
There was a study, it was before I was on council, was it 2015? There was a park study about recreational space and open space, and
it was the fee study,
maybe,
I think, in 2017.
I thought I remembered that there was a number in there that
I think
correlated open space, and that's why I was asking that
Yeah.
question, to see if we had an update on that number. But I'm also fine with it not being the correct question. So, yeah.
I had a question just to get your expert advice while you're here. So given, I actually wasn't aware quite that the more than tripling of the budget in the recreation department, also comparing that to the amount per capita we spend compared to other communities that were very low still. And so it is very possible that as a community, we will decide to invest more in this area on a per capita basis. And my question is, assuming for the moment we are going to do that, I'm wondering about your recommendations or opinions about how we do something like build a community center or kind of put things in ground that sort of aim for specific things when we're still building out stuff and we don't yet know all the things we're going to offer. So how we can balance that in the short and medium term, knowing that in the long term it might look very different than it does today.
So I think that in general, recreation facility, multi-purpose, first is the best way to go at being adaptable. So having gymnasium, having breakout rooms of varying sizes or movable walls, for example, where you could have a small late meeting in a small area versus expanding to 3 rooms into 1 to having a craft event for youth, right? So having that flexibility of a space really is going to be critical to what's needed now and as you move forward to, say, growing groups and growing needs within the community. I think the key is, as you look at your program needs, the program, I think, drives a lot of what you currently need for a space requirement. And if you can't meet that within current city facilities, is there one place that's already open within the city, as in, say, the schools, for example, or another community location? Or how do you meet that need within this center of a sort? For example, if you have a basketball league, right? So you have, maybe in the summer it's outdoors. You need to improve your outdoor basketball facilities. Some are dated, but you can have that program going. They might need lights because they're going to have the shoulder hours of the day where you want to have that program going. Now, when you continue the program through the winter, you need a great court indoors, maybe 2 courts, because you want to have a league and have one game going at a time. So is that 2 courts within one recreation facility, or you can use the high school or middle school, which probably has a basketball program in the evenings hours with limited space, maybe only available on the weekends. So it's working with that program as to how do you grow and have that flexibility so that you can make that investment. And a community center really is one key location that you will build that, and as programs are growing and expanding, you can see if they can be consolidate one location or spread out into other smaller locations as programs develop and grow, because it's all about being flexible. What you need right now may not at all be a need in 10 years just due to changing interests of users.
Great, thank you.
One thing that surprised me in the survey was that seemed that the group that is the largest group in Beacon seems to be middle-aged people or late middle-aged people, and that there's the biggest gap between services for the percentage of services. And I never really thought of my age group as a group that needs these kinds of services, but then I was like, well, yeah, but in your experience, what kind of programming really exists for middle-aged people who are really mostly just carting small people around?
That's a tough question.
You don't have to answer it if there's no clear answer.
I would say a lot of times, yes, it's middle-aged adults are caring for others, whether it's for youth or for seniors. Mm-hmm. So their time is spread very thin. What attracts most that demographic is actually very pointed opportunities for engagement. So it may not be a 6-week Taekwondo class. It might be that Saturday 9 to 1 on February 13th to come on out and have a event of a sort of interest. Mm-hmm. So it's a very pointed, because time is very limited, so make the user time value their time. Yeah. Because otherwise they're going to go and be caring for others. That maybe it's the 6-week youth Taekwondo or seniors being transported to other needs. Mm-hmm. So it's very pointed and very specific programming for the age demographics. But when the younger or the older are handled and cared for, that demographic can tend to feel like they're being served because the burden's on them to then program for those two demographics, you know what I mean? So they're at that in-between zone of caring for others.
Yeah, I saw a couple of the graphs on programming by different age groups, and I was trying to think through, well, so we've always thought about it as more of a youth arrangement. It used to be more social organizations that would provide, and that's been changing over time, which is one of the reasons that the city portion of that recreation programming keeps going up, and we're choosing that. But service organizations or religious communities have been kind of filling those gaps, and that happens less today. And I think it falls on us to kind of think through, and it may be more senior and middle programs, because I think we naturally think about the younger ones. Now, some of those senior programs might be provided at facilities where seniors are housed, so we should take that into account. But I think it makes sense that we should kind of broaden our horizons some.
I would add to that, too, that I think a lot of the private partnerships, either be the school district or other private entities around, tend to focus on the young people already, and that seems to be an area that's growing, whereas I'm less familiar with the stuff that's for the middle-aged and the older, aside from those who live in facilities that are dedicated to older populations. So that might be an area where we could spend our collective resources as a community, but we might not need as much in the kid area, or maybe need both, but yeah, thinking through how we can leverage existing public-private partnerships and where we might need to actually put more city effort into building out stuff.
And some of that older demographic, they aren't necessarily looking for a location to do an event. They sometimes want to go on field trips or go places as a city-sponsored place event, because half of it's the bus ride, the social, to go hiking or to go shopping or to see a musical in the city. So it's the experience for that demographic not always just the event.
Right. Yeah, I'm thinking about our walking trail system, like if they could meet up with a group, that might make them more likely or interested to go out on those.
Have you found in other studies that you've done, like an overlap between the need for social services and recreation services overlapping, and do you find there's opportunities there?
I do. Every community is very different with how they handle the varying needs, but as we're saying, this is a community center, I think that it's the right opportunity to meet that growing need for other services that not recreational services. And the staff is equipped with enough of the tools that they can provide that as well, or have others come in, say it's a providing food for users or residents. They can facilitate that and have, say, others come in and bring food in and then use that facility to offer that as needed. Or reading programs, or other kind of social needs within the community. They can house it, and they can definitely chaperone that through the process for those that may be more trained or experienced to provide those.
So if we did consider, following up on a feasibility study of some sort for a community center, these would be things that we would also incorporate in that study of the needs of the community.
Yeah, the term community is very broad. So it'd be you currently have a demand or a need within the community. How can this one location provide those? Some things that may be considered as to having multiple access points to community center, so that if there is a food pickup, it's not the front door where the youth are going in for a sporting activity, right? It's a side door for those that are in need of services. But so that process of developing that feasibility study is really important to know how this building location is going to meet those very needs, and how do you accommodate those in the private or the public setting as necessary for residents.
Great, thank you.
Just to follow up on that, are there specific examples of communities you've worked with that you've seen do this successfully, this overlap of recreational and social services that we can look to?
I don't recall offhand exact names of locations, but we can certainly get you a list of those that have very similar. Again, every municipality is very different to how you handle them from a department standpoint, but most offer to some degree in locations, say, recreation facilities, after school programs, which is also the food service for some communities is very common to provide that need for within a community. We're currently working in Albany, looking at their recreation facility as to how can they accommodate growing need to feed their youth. They're coming for after-school programs, therefore needing a bigger kitchen that they can actually prepare food, not simply have to have food that is delivered for their recreation services on a daily basis. So it varies, but we can get some examples of where we've seen that successfully done.
I mean,
I think, go ahead, Chris.
You've seen that done pretty successfully with our after-school programs, which are bursting at the seam now. Those are an enhancement, and therefore, giving kids an option after school to learn something different. But we also know that people on the lower income spectrum use those services as childcare because they're not widely available. Additionally, when we needed to do food aid, our recreation department, Mark, handled the purchase of $25,000 worth of food that was then distributed out and served as the nexus for getting out testing kits and masks. So when we have those type of things, recreation has been our go-to department, and that really is something. Even with like the compost program, those compost, again, it's not a social service, but again, we're expanding well beyond just old-time recreation of ball fields and football.
Yeah, I think that illustrates, Chris, really well what I was going to say, which is this model of having those two things really integrated with each other. If I heard the example you were saying, Dan, correctly, an example of there's one door for this and one door for that. I think this model of having the same door for everything is better. We don't want to end up in a situation where we're stigmatizing those who are asking for certain things.
Yeah, no, I wasn't implying that at all. It's just that thinking through design of a facility is to acknowledging that there's varying needs of the building, and how do you properly design that appropriately? Again, one door for meeting all needs is the right approach, but how do you make sure that if you need to have a discrete setting or accommodations, that you're able to do that within the building facility footprint itself?
Or some type of loading dock,
Exactly.
something much just more logistical.
Definitely. I had one more question, which may actually be for Nick. I wanted to make sure I appreciate that one of the recommendations was around really leaning into partnerships. And I wanted to understand programming-wise, I think we've come up against with our community grants, only being able to spend money on certain things, and certain not being able to spend money on certain types of programming. And I just wanted to clarify, as we're thinking through partnership ideas, what limitations we should be mindful of in terms of spending tax dollars.
I think generally the limitation is that the city council needs to be comfortable that it is serving a public purpose. It's not a limited private purpose, and that it's open to all residents. And I think those are the general restrictions that we're talking about. I think generally these programs are permissible.
Yeah, I'm thinking of examples, particularly around senior needs and programs that may happen within a private facility. And if there are ways that we can support programs like that.
Understood. Maybe I can work with Mark and get a better sense of what those might be.
Yeah, there's, for example, a private nonprofit that is doing really successful programming at Forrestal Heights for the seniors there. But my understanding is because it is for Forrestal individuals in particular.
Right. If it's limited just to those residents, then it would be problematic because it's not open to all city residents.
Right. But it could maybe be there, but if the program was intentionally open to all residents,
And that was a
that would be
location.
okay.
Right. That were a location, that might be acceptable.
Okay. Thank you for walking through that.
Yes.
Anything else?
Just one very quick last question. The spike that we have in program registration, Mark, is that just because of higher enrollment in the after-school program, or is there another program that's kind of driving that big increase?
Mark, use the mic. So.
The program spike is directly related to an increase in activity in programs, but also the use of our online platform. So we're capturing a great deal more of some of those other registrations.
I see.
Pool, swim lessons, summer camp, after school. So yeah,
Cool.
We've come online almost completely with all the programming and the registration platform. So we have a better sense of how to track it.
Great.
And can I just make a couple of comments and leave you with 3 thoughts? So if you looked at that funding graph, it showed, the increase in funding. I know that money, was, correlates directly to the time that City Council decided to take over the BCC building and create a rec center, make my department full-time. We went from 1 part-time staffer to, within a couple of years, 3 full-time staffers, and the ability to, run programming, create programming, a space to do it in. So that all, syncs up. So all it takes is a little bit of space, a little bit of people, and things can happen, and a little bit of money. 3 thoughts I'd leave you with. Besides that, actually one other thing which Dan had mentioned, but there's a lot in that report handed to us in the back of it with recommendations to the parks and our facilities that we can just extract and they're actionable items through our DPW and our Parks Department. So there's stuff we can work on, and we're currently working on. There's some check boxes I can already make on that stuff. So that's an incredibly useful tool for us to have it sort of categorized and set up in such a way that we can work towards making improvements along the way. It doesn't mean everything has to halt and we have to reinvent the wheel. All this stuff is going to, every year, gets a little bit better. 3 thoughts I'd leave you with are, I believe this report's a good point to discuss, revitalizing our recreation committee, maybe revisioning our recreation committee in such a way that it's a recreation and community committee. I believe with this document, we have, the path forward, and the usefulness of the community will help us get there. It's those ideas, what a community center is, or what's involved in that, really the public input is important, and they can help us figure these things out. These are people that could go visit other centers, and, I think we're at a point where that committee can be useful, not that it hasn't in the past, but we had a bit of a hiatus, and its usefulness in that we didn't have much for them to do, and it's hard to call meetings and not have much to do. You want stuff, people to be vested in participating and helping. The other thing was the thought of in what I had mentioned earlier, it's a little bit of people, a little bit of space, so we can do things. We may want to consider, looking at, adding to the recreation staff. We've been tossing around the idea for a couple of seasons now. How can we do more? We need more bandwidth. Sometimes it's a matter of, maybe even just clearing space on my desk and somebody else's desk, and certain tasks can be created. We have a community liaison or something where the position would be community facing and facilitating in that day-to-day work that sort of bogs us down. Any given day I answer 3 social service related or community service related questions or more. I put people in touch, all my staff, but people in touch with the right parties. That's part of the traffic control on a daily basis there. Not everyone's calling about where's the coolest basketball court. Most of the people calling are looking for something in the community, and they either call around or they just call the rec department. They'll know what time the train leaves on Saturdays or whatever it is. It's always exciting to find out what's gonna call in, and more importantly, answer the question. I like to leave people with the answers. And my third thought was in my back pocket. I can't remember things when I get rattling around.
I think the feasibility study.
Yes, thank you. The other was, in Dan's report, had mentioned, thoughts moving forward. If we indeed want this thing, we should think about what it is. And, we have a current center, is there a possible way of reusing or repurposing that or expanding upon it? And that takes professional services, and again, what goes in it may be part of that committee. It's all kind of, collective, but, I think next steps are, another round of, sort of thoughtful and professional services that sort of get us a little bit closer to what it may be. That's all I had.
And when we were developing the 2023 budget, Mark and I toiled with, at what point do we add staff? At what point do we increase capacity? And it's always, we were trying to get through the study, so we didn't propose any additions in last year's budget. But you've seen that we've added more and more to his plate, like the community investment grants. Somebody has to work on that, and now work with a recreation committee, hopefully, to score those and bring those to you. We've done a lot of support for the Green Teens over at our site. If we do a feasibility study, it's a lot of additional work to try to nail down what's the program, what's the space that goes with it, what's the building look like, what are the components of it, is it something you could phase? And so I would like to finish out the report. There's a couple changes that have to be made by the end of the month, but what I'd like to work on is reconstituting this rec committee. So if you know people that might be interested in that, please ask them to fill out an application online and send us a resume, and we can try to do that as one of the first outtakes. I also may be coming back to you at some point with some incremental changes mid-year rather than at the end of the budget year, because I think we have a fairly clear direction that we're needing to expand capacity here.
Yeah, when I was trying to think of the next steps here, I would split, and I think you've done that, capital versus programming. I think capital-wise, I think that's a feasibility study. I think programming-wise, I think it is an opportunity to start up, kind of reinvigorate a rec committee. And I think what we could do is sort of offer up here's like 5 years what it might look like, rough number, just total. And it's like, well, if it were growing, it's not going to triple any more times, right? I mean, we've kind of done that piece. But let's say it's growing, I don't know, pick a number, 10% a year for the next 5. And you're looking at that list, and even if it doesn't grow, suppose it's flat, whatever the number is, what programs would you want to do when, and to get kind of a group that you could get a sounding board on that, and then start to come back and say, all right, those senior things, okay, here's what we're thinking. And it could just be, portion of programming. You don't have to know the details, right? But I think you might be able to kind of advance it that way, kind of splitting it into feasibility versus programming, engaging a new group, and then kind of saying, where am I heading as an objective for that group next 5 years?
And on the capital side, when you did the capital program last year, you put $7.8 million in recreation for the next 5 years. So, we are looking at some major improvements to the parks. And we do them as we can. Like when we were paving, we did repave the basketball court at Green Street. Or, like we know there's a drainage issue at the basketball courts at Memorial, and I don't need a capital project necessarily to just fix that. So I think we want to do that programming and support it with good facilities as well.
When we go to this feasibility study for the community center, I mean, we're focusing on building, conceptualizing the perfect building for the need, but there's options for location, but location would be determined by maybe the size and footprint of the needed building. Does that all go into the same study, or are there multiple steps? I'm just thinking of the firehouse presentations that used to come up every now and again, and they kind of went on forever, and I just want to avoid that with the community center.
Yeah, I mean, I think the most efficient use of those, that planning money would be to settle on a spot. So if it's the current rec center, and how do we rebuild that or expand upon it, I think there's another layer to it if you have to move it or come up with, new real estate to do so, unless it's, of course, part of a, complex. But I think we're specifically talking about a singular location at this point, and maybe, as we move forward and sort of over the years, it's, maybe, the next site may be, clear to us, based on availability. But I think we'd want to settle in on, where we are currently and how we can make that corner of the park, better and, more usable for, future years. But, that's my opinion.
Yeah, I think that would all go into feasibility. And I wouldn't want to prejudge, although I would say, with respect to the Central Fire Station experience, choosing an existing site dropped the cost dramatically, right? And made us not only be able to do it and bring it all the way up to date, but it also kind of leaves us some room to keep going. And so that's always a consideration. So
I also am feeling like, because we're growing or have grown so rapidly, knowing just a little bit more about our programming and what we want as a community is helpful before we put the finishing touches on a feasibility study. But I appreciate it's a 5-year program, if not longer. So to have those two things run in parallel right now seems to make sense, so that whatever we decide on for facilities lines up for both whatever our current programming and our vision for programming in the future.
Yeah.
Okay, you know what to do. Just go out and do it and come back.
Sorry, I have one follow-up question, if that's okay. It seems like we're perhaps at a tipping point around making explicit this project as a recreation thinking specifically about the Recreation Committee, about keep making this a recreation project versus a recreation and community project or recreation and social services project. Mark, you said that there is potential for a re-envisioning of the recreation committee to perhaps include that community part of the vision. And, you know, if this piece of homework that we've been given of trying to recruit people for this new recreation committee, I'm wondering if there is a step to formally say or formally expand the mission of the recreation committee so that we're accurately recruiting the right people for the right job. Was that at all clear? Sorry, I fumbled my intro.
Well, I think we're all in agreement.
Yeah, yes, there's room to, you know, a bit of discussion prior to, you know, sort of calling the first meeting, I think is definitely in order, you know, so we know where we're headed for sure.
Okay.
All right. Good.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, Dan and Mark, thank you both.
Thank you.
And we'll get a final report maybe by the end of the month, you think?
Yep, send over your edits and we'll get them incorporated, make some other revisions and.
Okay, so the other homework is send any other edits that you find, please.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Dan.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you, Mark.
All right. Next item is local law on electrification, and I think, Nick, you're going to lead us on that, or am I, anything we need to?
That's correct. I'm set to lead the discussion on that. So in your agenda packet is a draft local law that we've prepared. We've also included the other materials that we've been reviewing over the past couple of weeks to frame of reference. The local law would amend Chapter 106, which is the city's code provision on energy conservation, and it would require new construction of residential and commercial buildings to become all electric within a certain time frames. And we'll get into those in a moment. Let me just provide, I guess, an overview of a law that we've drafted. I also want to make clear that it's understood it applies to new construction, doesn't apply to appliances, doesn't apply to retrofitting, doesn't apply to existing. It's focused on new construction, whether it's a single-family home or a multi-family building, or in later years, commercial construction. So Section 106-30 sets forth the intent and the purpose, sets forth the authority. And so in 106-30A, we go through in some degree as to the basis and what the goals and intent here, relying upon the local energy code supplement that's permitted by New York State, the Green Amendment, and the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act to sort of set forth the basis. And then in Section B, we have, I believe, is it 12 different findings that the council has made. And these are all derived from the discussions we've had over workshop, comments we've received from the public, and just recognizes why the council is doing this and the findings that support your belief that it's necessary to ban fossil fuels and require clean energy or electric energy, at least through this local law. And it sets forth, as you've read, all the different justifications for it, including environmental impacts, impact on health, indoor air quality, and things of that nature. So if you have any specific comments on those, let me know, but these are all taken from our discussions. And then Section C on the third page of local law, what's your authority? You're adopting this law, but what is your authority? So it's under Section 11-109 of the New York State Energy Law, which allows the city, subject to a review by the New York State Codes Council, to have more stringent energy requirements than New York State provides. We also rely upon the New York State Constitution, the Green Amendment, which is Article 1, Section 19, that guarantees each person the right to clean air and water and a healthful environment. And this law would further enact that constitutional right. And then in Section 106-31, we talk about the applicability. What does this apply to? Talks about all new buildings as set forth later on. And then in Section C, it gives you the 3 exemptions that we've discussed in our workshops. Emergency backup power systems, generators can still be supplied by natural gas. Municipal water and sewer facilities can be supplied by natural gas. And we spoke about the energy needs and those existing operations that it's just not there yet with the technology. And then any project that receives site plan approval from a planning board prior to June 30th, 2023 would be exempt from having to comply with this act. Those are the exemptions. We then have a number of definitions in section 106-32, some of which we've looked at before. The definition of major renovation was revised pursuant to our discussion with the City Council at the last workshop. We've also had the building inspector, Bruce Flower, review this, and he's comfortable that from his ability to administer and enforce and explain the law, that this definition of major renovation works for him, which reads that any construction or renovation to an existing structure other than a repair or addition where the work area exceeds 75% of the heated floor area and involves a replacement or new installation of the heating or hot water system. And then says that changes to ventilation and air conditioning systems are not considered renovations of the heating system. This is also similar to the language that was used in the city and town of Ithaca when they looked at the issue of major renovation. And then at the heart of the local laws in section 106-32, entitled All Electric Building Requirements, and this has the dates where it would apply. And the first in section A says that effective January 1st, 2024, no building permit application shall be accepted by the building department and no building permit issued for new construction or major renovation of residential buildings which require the use of fossil fuels to power any equipment or building systems therein, including space heating, water heating, cooking, and clothes drying. In section B, we applied that same language, but applied it to the portion of a mixed-use building for residential purposes. You may recall we've had discussions about how to deal with mixed use. Our office has reached out to NYSERDA. We've not received any substantial assistance or clarification from them. In speaking with some design engineers out there, they said that what they've seen is that the residentials are going electric and commercial are kept as coming in at phasing at a later date. So that's how we've drafted this law. Residential as of January 1st, 2024, residential and mixed use as of January 1st, 2024, commercial as of January 1st, 2027, and the commercial portion of a mixed use building in section D would also be January 1st, 2027. I apologize, there was a typo in an earlier version that said 2024. For section D, that is 2027. And then in section E, we provided that with respect to oil tanks, all plans submitted in connection with new construction, which would involve the removal of an oil tank, maybe it's a tear down you have as an oil tank, just want to make sure those oil tanks are closed in accordance with appropriate regulation. And likewise, that if it's a building, it's a new construction, but it's on a lot that has a gas pipeline, we just want to make sure that that gas pipeline is safely capped off. And that's brought to the attention when they're submitting their building permit application. As we discussed, there may be examples of hardships under the law, and we want to provide that relief valve and an opportunity for someone to be heard and make their argument that they, despite efforts, cannot comply. So section 106-33 is a hardship exemption. It's more of an economic, so I'm going to revise that just so that it's hardship exemption. And then in section 106-33C, it states that one would apply to the ZBA to obtain a hardship based upon establishing the existence of compliance with the article is not financially, technically, or physically, infeasible. And then it sets forth that the zoning board would make those decisions. So that's an overview of a local law. The next step would be, if you're comfortable with this draft of a local law or any changes you make tonight, at your Monday meeting or Tuesday meeting, to then next week to schedule a public hearing, and we could also have this referred to the planning board, and the public hearing you could set would be for, I believe it's February 27th, and we would ask that the planning board would consider this at their February 15th agenda. The planning board would be able to get you comments back before your public hearing.
And
Mayor, that's my overview.
And we tried to get Bruce to attend this evening in case you had questions in terms of enforcement. He was unable to come tonight, but we do have him on the agenda for the 21st. So you'll get to meet Bruce if you haven't met Bruce, our new building inspector.
We interviewed him.
Oh, that's correct.
This is great, Nick. I have a couple areas with questions, if we're ready for that, but
Yes,
is there anything else you wanted to? This section where you introduced the oil tanks was interesting to me, and I wanted to know if there was something that could be or needs to be extended to maybe the removal of propane tanks or other kinds of storage of fuel other than oil tanks. And my second question with regards to that paragraph was, is there a preferred or ideal, I don't know how to ask the question, point where we want the pipe capped? Meaning, you know, if you're renovating a building and you're removing the natural gas connections, do you want to cap that pipe a foot away from your foundation, or are you capping it out by the road? And will that matter? Sorry.
Yep, I will ask Bruce that.
Actually, I think
Certainly,
Chris
Bruce
is about to
question.
answer.
Nick, I can answer this because we just went through it with the firehouse. If you want to shut off the gas, you have to put in the request through Central Hudson, and they turn it off at the valve. And after they do that, then you can remove the gas pipe. So like our gas for the firehouse is fed off of South Avenue. Since we're not using any gas in the heating of that building, it's all electric, we're applying to have them shut that valve off, which is kind of buried beneath the street. And then we would just remove the pipe because it would be abandoned. Yeah, so it's like your water supply where you have valves at different spots that you could shut off.
So really, there's nothing for us to write into the law about this. We would
Not
just
for
follow
gas.
the standard.
Yeah, it's the oil tanks. Like we had an oil tank too that we had to remove.
And I think if we change the word from oil tank to petroleum tanks, I believe that would capture propane.
If there are any, right?
Right. Mhm.
Because I think our heritage is oil tanks, right?
For sure, yeah. I've seen a few propane tanks around,
Yeah.
but they used to have oil.
So, yeah, certainly the old houses all had oil tanks, so. I've got one, let's back up to the front. You have the inapplicability in 31C, you go municipal water and sewer. I understand why we're doing that. I wonder whether any of the large industrial facilities on 52, which are probably of the ilk of our water or sewer facility, meaning a big industrial facility, whether we're hurting ourselves if we don't sort of think through when that should occur. I did not read through the state's several hundred-page report on how they achieve their goals. I need to look at industrial, but it's sort of the same category of tall buildings and other commercial sites where it's going to, you really have to think specifically about those. So I like to put a marker on industrial and then explore with either NYSERDA or the Climate Action Council what they're thinking with respect to those.
Well, this wouldn't interrupt any of the existing facilities because this is for all new construction, right?
Right. But I'm
Correct.
thinking about something going on 52, right? Where we, get a commercial establishment coming in and wanting to do something, and I want us to either exempt it or cover it correctly, right?
Isn't it covered through the hardship exemption? If that were to come up, if somebody were to want to bring something in?
Well, so the issue with the hardship exemption is we can do anything we want and put in a hardship exemption, and if we've done everything wrong, then everything becomes a hardship exemption. I think we should think through each of the components and get what we think is correct into this, and then the hardship, honestly, I almost prefer not to have that, and we couldn't unless we know every piece is right, and we probably even then still need it, but I like to minimize that usage.
Nick, could we draw a distinction between commercial and industrial? Because I know what Lee's talking about, like Kempren
Yeah.
and the Industrial Arts Brewery, like they have a massive draw on energy for.
But
Yeah, I was going to say, this only applies to residential and commercial. So
I'm sorry?
we can draw the exemption in here that does not apply to industrial uses, if that's the intent.
So we've got, I think we just got on our calendar NYSERDA next week, and let's
Yes.
open a discussion with them, and we'll have them come to council too, and so we can talk our way through it, because I just want to feel like, again, only applies to new construction, but for instance, the example would be when Industrial Arts Brewery went in, there was, could be a substantial portion of their construction, or if Kemprine wanted to expand, right? We certainly want to permit it as long as they're doing it effectively. I'd want the legislation to get the most energy efficiency without precluding it, right? And so I just want to understand what that, how we would think about it, because I didn't see that anywhere.
So Nick, is it possible to look at whether or not there's some needle we can thread in our zoning so that this only applies to a very narrow band of buildings? And I think in terms of justice, like, what if you have a fire and they want to rebuild? And then, they would have to go through all kinds of hardship exemptions. I think about the place that just burned down, like, if you had to rebuild that, now they're under a different set of rules. Now, if it wasn't a complete loss and they still had some of their heating and stuff, you might want to allow them to rebuild, particularly if their industrial process doesn't conform to what's available for electric use. Like, you think about Niche Modern doing all that glass blowing, it's like, I don't think we're close to having something that has the density of natural gas for heating those products.
Well, it might be as easy as classifying them into the commercial category, first of all. That kind of pushes it off to 27. Or finding in the state's roadmap how they think about it, right? It's going to be in there. I didn't look the first time for industrial.
And we
Right.
did set up a call for Nick and me on Monday with NYSERDA. I don't know if they're going to come to council. They've been reluctant to even respond to us.
Okay, all right. Well,
And we
that's-
do have in the definition of commercial building, any building that is not included in the definition of residential building.
Right. We might be able to just do that.
And residential building is any building as defined in the residential code of New
That's
York
not
State.
commercial.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing that's interesting about NYSERDA, and I want to learn about, is they've got 2 municipalities they're working their way through to get what do they call it, a stretch to zero pilot program?
Correct.
You referenced that, Nick, in your December memo. I really
Yes.
want to ask about that, right? Because if they're going to expand it, and you're suggesting they might, then maybe one of the things we could do is get into that pilot program.
And they said they'd let us know if they open that again. That
Yeah.
program is not open for new
Okay.
municipalities at the moment.
You can
Correct.
always ask.
Oh, we did, yeah.
Okay, cool. So that was the one, thank you.
I liked under the hardship process that E under 106633 says that even those who are granted a hardship exemption, they shall have required to have at a minimum to have sufficient electric capacity, wiring, and conduit to facilitate future full building electrification. And I'm wondering if it's possible, and I don't know a lot about it, maybe a question for Bruce next time, if we could also require that of our commercial. They don't have to have all electric now, but any new construction should also have the capacity to become full electric. If there's a way that we could put that, or we want to put that in the law as well. And maybe for our industrial as well. So basically all those were saying, you don't have to do this now, but we want you to put in the wiring to make it possible. You can tell I don't know a lot about how this works. Whatever the best language is to make that true for those places as well.
Yep, and I don't know how feasible that is, so that's a Bruce question as well, but I understand the point. We'll ask him.
Yeah, the other thing I would want to ask NYSERDA or someone like it, there's 2 elements. One, again, I'd love us to not have any hardship exemptions, right? So one of the questions would be, when are we expecting incentive programs by what type of construction to come into play, right? So if we knew that for commercial buildings, they've put an incentive program in place at the statewide level, then again, we wouldn't need to have this. We'd say, go do the incentives, right? Nick, I don't think we can do any incentives, can we?
So I believe you can, we have to put some limitations on it, but we'd have to talk about what incentives and what that looks like and what role the municipality would have in encouraging people to switch out.
Okay. So I want to ask, again, the state folks about that. And then the other one is the one issue that we're splitting the baby, which is a mixed-use building that's residential and commercial. I just want to understand, because I think we already got an email from an owner of a Main Street building saying that that's kind of tough to kind of split up, right? I know the one building that my wife and I worked on was 6 units on 2 floors and then a commercial space, and it had a single boiler, right? And I think buildings of that footprint might be hard to split. And I want to just understand from NYSERDA, how do we think about this, right?
And that would only apply either, certainly in a new construction or in a substantial renovation. So I think it would come up pretty rarely with respect to existing infrastructure.
No, I understand, but if you're putting up a new building in, say, a really narrow space on Main Street, not a big one, but a smaller one, and you've only got, I don't know, 3,000 or 4,000 square feet, and half of it is residential and half is commercial, the concept that we would require, the commercial piece at a different point than the residential may not make sense. We might like to split the baby, but it may be hard to do it. And I'm just looking for, give us a construct to work with, because I'm sure they considered this in their report. And I'll go dig into the report as well and see if I can find that. I didn't look for that the first time.
Yeah, I'm aware of that being something that the large developers already do in larger buildings, but to your point, to buildings that are smaller, I don't know enough about it to know what's feasible.
It's like zones, it's like building zones. There's a separate heat pump for each zone, I would think, right? Like you would have a different compressor for each zone of your building, right?
Right, which
I'm
would,
thinking.
yeah, that would be a reason to have it be all electric, right? And it could be
Or
that,
separated, you could still separate it, maybe.
well, it could be what we discover is that below a certain size, remember what we're reading is that the residential 3 stories and under, the economics apparently make sense. And it could be that small buildings also make sense, even if they're part commercial. But I need to learn a little bit more in there before I kind of get comfortable. So I'm just looking for a little expertise. I'm not disagreeing with this split of in how we do it. I just want to learn a little bit more.
Right. A question that I would have for NYSERDA too is what they think about our effective date for the commercial. I don't know, Nick, have you encountered a compelling argument why a city should follow the state's lead in delaying commercial?
The argument, as I understand, is technology is not there and the incentives are not there from the state. And I think the state is also concerned about not having appropriate number of trained individuals for both the commercial and the residential and trained in the commercial trade. That's what I've heard and understand.
Could you repeat that again?
Sure. That the reasons the commercial is lagging behind the residential is due to concerns about the technology not being there for all commercial uses. Last time we discussed domestic hot water heater in larger buildings being an example. The second being the state not having all the incentives in place. And the third being the state's concerned about the workforce, one, not being sufficient for the demand of the electrical all at once, and two, not having enough trained individuals for that either. Not having the right training and not a sufficient large enough workforce. So that's my understanding why you have the phased-in approach of residential and commercial. Mm-hmm. And hopefully, Chris, when we have that conversation with NYSERDA, they can elaborate upon that for us.
Yeah, I haven't, I mean, the statewide arguments are interesting and feel right. I don't know how well they translate to the city level, though. And, when I was thinking about commercial, I was thinking, well, we could include commercial with residential, and then as the technology catches up, new types of businesses can begin to, move and build and beacon if they wanted to. As opposed to waiting for the technology to catch up, we could just say, commercial has to go electric, and as business models change with, as technology changes with time, that means that more and more types of businesses can move electric, can electrify and beacon.
Yeah, the rationale that, Nick, you mentioned is what I saw in the state's report, right? Every time they said, we would start later for this, it was always because either the technology wasn't there yet, or the incentives weren't in place, or, something along those lines, right? I mean, residential, they stopped at 3 stories because above 3 stories, the ability to kind of push the heat in particular up was an issue, kind of technology issue. So let's learn about that as well, because I want to be able to argue effectively and asking, the authors of that report, what were they thinking? How do we understand this? Would be very helpful for us.
Just to clarify a couple of things, NYSERDA didn't write this report. Okay, there's an advisory panel that wrote a report, and these are recommendations. This is not the policy of the state of New York right now. It has not been adopted by the legislature. It is, so we're well ahead of them. These were ideas that were thrown out, and they haven't been codified into law. And again, I don't know how much use. It's been really hard to just get NYSERDA on the phone. I would say Bruce is probably can speak to the experience here with the types of buildings he's seeing built, because he told me the other day some of them are already largely electric. Like Hiplofts is all electric.
I mean, we're not, in lieu of NYSERDA or whatever state agency we want to invite to city council, there may be people in the public also who might be very well educated about these things, and I don't know, we could reach out to folks in the community too. I mean, I know we want something more official and something more with broader scope, but.
And they can also share their experiences, when you have your public hearing, or write in written comments beforehand.
Right.
I look forward to Bruce being here too.
Yeah.
The only other question I had was about the definition of major renovations. And I read it a few times, and I'm just struggling with the and versus or part of the sentence. So a major renovation is currently is defined as any construction or renovation to an existing structure other than a repair or addition where the work area, so it does not include repairs other than a repair, construction or renovation, so other than a repair, where the work area exceeds 75% of the heated floor area, which is, I think, has been kind of a consistent number we've seen throughout this conversation, and involves the replacement or new installation of a heating or hot water system. So does that mean that electrification would take place in the 75% for all appliances that are included within that 75%?
No, I think it's only triggered. No, I think then you'd have to, well, you're not requiring them to switch out of the appliances.
I'm sorry?
Well, no, I'm sorry. Let me stand back. You're right. That it would apply. Well, if they're doing work that exceeds 75%, then they would have to switch out everything within 100% of the building.
No, Nick, that's not what, when we reviewed this with Bruce, he asked for the 75 because that's a clear standard by which he can enforce it. We also then had a discussion that didn't make sense. Like, let's say you bought an old Victorian house and you're renovating, all of the house, but you're not changing out. You just got a new heating system 5 years ago and you have an old system of steam generators. There's really no way to do that without going, spending tens of thousands of dollars more on that rehab.
Well, with steam, I read that you can do wall-mounted heat pumps.
But again, I'm just trying to clarify. Nick, is that correct? Because I don't believe.
I think that's right, Chris. Yes, from Bruce's conversation, yes. And he'll be here on the 21st, and we can have that discussion with him as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, we can talk about it with Bruce. I'm still a little confused, but we can have that conversation with him when he's here.
I will just say I am also confused by this section, and am looking forward to hearing from Bruce.
Okay, we'll make sure he's prepared for that.
Okay. Yeah, I note, again, looking at the state study, that the state study for existing construction doesn't have this criteria at all. It just says 2030 for heat and hot water, and 2035 for dryer and stove. And in both cases, it says at the end of their useful life. So that would be an alternative approach, right, that we could consider. But again, I'm happy to wait for Bruce. Okay.
I like that idea too.
Yeah, I think at the end of its useful life might be helpful language for us here as well.
Right. I mean, the state wasn't willing to impose that requirement at this stage, but when the technology's ready or the incentives are in place, that will get everything over time, whereas this will just get a very few pieces, when a complete reconstruction is occurring. So I just want to hear a little bit more to assess that.
Well, I mean, like,
Yeah.
I've never done a major renovation. I own my first home, and it's only 8 years old. But I would think that if I was doing a renovation of my home, I would only be replacing the appliances that have to be replaced. You know, like if I'm doing a whole new kitchen, but my stove is new, I don't know.
Yeah. Well, again, the example that Chris gave, you know, you buy a house that has a brand-new heating system, but you still want to do the, you know, the rehab for all the rooms. I'm not sure that's the right criteria that we want to establish. So again, I want to look at this as well. But I just want to wait till we get a chance to ask some questions.
Yeah, I think we just don't want to end up in the opposite situation where somebody is doing a major renovation and that includes replacing a new heating or cooling system, and somehow this doesn't apply to them. We do want to catch those people on the other side as well.
Right. Okay. Other questions?
No, I just say to the public, if, you know, if you have thoughts about what we're talking about tonight and some of these open questions that we have, particularly with regards to commercial and industrial and renovations, we'd love to hear from you next week. So please come to Monday night's meeting and tell us what you think, especially if you have experience with these things.
Okay. What's our next step on this?
So the next step would be to have us on for Monday or next meeting on Tuesday night to schedule this for a public hearing for February 27th, and then refer to we can informally send it to the planning board. We can work with staff to make sure it gets on their agenda for the 15th.
So would we want to wait for some input from either Bruce or state folks or first, or do we want to just start up the process and maybe we make changes as we go? I don't know what people prefer.
I'd like to start up the process. We already have Bruce on the calendar for the 21st, which will be before that public hearing on the 27th. And it sounds, from our conversation, it sounds like he's the one that we want to hear from most, in addition to getting things started with the planning board.
Sounds good.
All right. So what we'll do is put an item on the next council meeting to set a workshop,
Yeah.
set a hearing date? Okay.
And maybe a meeting with
Yes.
NYSERDA.
Right? Well, let's see what we
If we
learn,
can
right?
get them, we'll ask.
Yeah.
We've been trying.
So let's see what we
Not
get.
without, yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. Next up is an HVAC maintenance services agreement with Carrion Walsh for City Hall, and that's Chris.
Yes. So this is a 2-year agreement with Carrion Walsh, Inc., which does the maintenance and repairs on our HVAC system, both at City Hall and the Highway Department. We were going through contracts that expired at the end of the year and realized that this needed to be renewed. It's over $20,000, so I'm not able to sign it without bringing it to council. The other one for the Highway Department is under 20, and I can sign that. And both of these have been budgeted for. We've had a great experience with Carrion Walsh, and yeah, there's no issues other than we tried to go from a 1-year contract to 2 years so that we don't have to do this every year.
A little typo thing in the witness F section. The fifth whereas says on February 14th, and our next meeting is going to be February 13th.
No, it's the 14th.
Yeah, we remember.
Lincoln's birthday.
Yeah, we're closed for the one of the 2 President's Days, which are recognized as a union holiday here.
Oh, for the one next week as well?
Yeah, so
Oh,
so
all right.
our
Next
schedule.
Tuesdays we're meeting.
Our schedule is the next 2 Monday meetings are moved to the Tuesday night. So we have, unfortunately, we're here on Valentine's Day and then the 21st.
Okay,
And then
great.
we're back to Mondays for the 27th.
Awesome. Thank you for confirming that for me.
Sure.
And for the public, too, as well, who might not have known.
Sure.
So that was actually my setup.
I mean, I was looking forward to spending Valentine's Day with all of you.
That's right.
Especially Nick, right?
Yes, thank
All
you.
right, good.
I'll come here in person.
Just out of curiosity, how has the pricing changed, did you say? I'm sorry.
The pricing, I think, is the same as the last contract. they carried the price.
Okay. And here's one I don't know anything about, the sight line easement at 46 Judson, but Nick's going to tell us about it.
So on October 12, 2022, the planning board approved a two-lot subdivision at the intersection of Judson Street and Union Street. As part of the planning board's approval, they required that the property owner impose what's called a sightline easement on their property. In essence, your code requires that for properties at intersections, there be a sightline easement which prevents obstruction from being placed within that area so that when one comes to the stop line, they can make that turn around the corner to make sure there are no obstructions or vehicles coming in their way. So this sightline easement would be imposed to the benefit of the city and allow the city to maintain that sightline, whether it's removal of trees, perhaps it's a decorative stone wall or something that is placed within that sightline. And this is there for increased public safety. It was reviewed by the planning board during their review of the subdivision. And in your packet is the subdivision map that shows where that sightline easement is at the intersection of Judson Street and Union Street. So by this resolution, you're just authorizing the city administrator to accept that easement, which will then get recorded and future property owners are on notice as to the city's rights.
And Nick, I haven't seen this before. This is typical of every new construction at an intersection, is that right?
It is, yes.
So because there was no home kind of closer to that corner and really nothing going on at that corner, there was never an easement, but now that there are houses going there, we need to have one?
That is correct, yes. Your code requires it.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought it, yeah, I was asking the same question to myself. Is it anytime there's a construction, or is it a subdivision that triggers this?
It's not construction. It's when there is a land use approval issued by the one of the boards.
So the planning board is the trigger, right? If they see something that they decide needs to be done?
Correct, yes.
Okay.
I'm just checking to see. It is, I believe it's within your subdivision code and also can be required as part of the site plan.
Thank
You know, the one thing I'm thinking about with this easement, so just in full disclosure, I live about 80 feet away from this corner. So the 10 feet is from where the lot meets the road, the 10 feet going up each street, and so that doesn't seem like much of a sightline easement. Is that 10 feet dictated by something? Was it a request by the planning board, or is it something that can be influenced?
It is reviewed by the planning board. I'm not familiar with this particular application. I can certainly check to see how that was derived at. I believe it's derived at either in the code language or upon the Institute of Traffic Engineers requirements for safe sight lines at an intersection.
All right. Well, I don't want to mess with the experts, but
I'll double check to make sure that the correct site easement is there.
Okay. Everybody good? All right, so we got a budget amendment.
We do.
Want to take us through it, Chris?
Yeah. So we, during the repaving last year, we moved from having loops under the ground by these by lights that triggered when the lights would change, and we convinced NISTOT to work with us to put in detection cameras so that like if a light doesn't have some type of detection device, it's just on a timer. And then you sit there for 30 seconds or 45 seconds. With these detection devices, usually the loop in the ground or the video, it will sense when there's no traffic queued up and you're trying to go through the intersection, and it will change the light. It cost us $20,000 and $20,003 to buy the camera that the DOT will install at Main Street and Wolcott Avenue. And so we're moving that money from contingency to the capital program. And this is the way that we're trying to move with all of the intersection signals, like the ones that we're doing on Fishkill-Teller Avenue. which is now out to bid as of Friday, those are also going to be camera activated. And that's more efficient, so you don't have people sitting there idling their cars. And then when we mill and pave, we don't dig up these wire loops that are underground.
So it's currently on a timer, you're saying, Wolcott and Main Street?
No, it was on a loop system. Like if you're going out of City Hall, you'll see a little box on in the pavement. That got ripped up on the other side. So it still has some kind of functionality for some of the areas, but not all. And we want to move it to all camera and just abandon that.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I assume that the pedestrian, that would continue to be request
Yes.
change? and
That
would be-
sets a different time.
Okay.
Yeah, that sets a dedicated time for the pedestrian to cross. And again, when we do Fishkill-Teller Avenue, we have included the interval, the pedestrian lead interval in Main Street and Teller. And I believe we've done that at Verplank as well.
Could you explain a little bit more about sort of the technology behind these cameras? As usual, I'm always concerned about excessive use of anything that could be used for facial recognition or surveillance beyond the specific purpose of the camera.
Yeah, so these cameras are motion detectors only. They don't read license plates, they don't issue fines, they don't do facial recognition. They're pretty basic cameras that just recognize the presence of a car and then would change the light based on the lack of presence of cars at the other parts of the intersection.
Thank you.
So they're fairly rudimentary, but I think they're a step above what we have in the road, because those things also get hit by the plows and sometimes inadvertently pulled up.
Yeah, I assume maintenance is much easier on the cameras than the loops.
Yes.
And are the cameras good at like detecting motorcycles as well?
I would imagine they are. They're a DOT product, and they have to recognize motor vehicles of all sizes. The question, that's a great question about the ones that we have in the ground, because if you're not over top it, so you probably get better detection.
Yeah, I've heard of people that have been like driving motorcycles at night, and if another car doesn't come behind them, the light just never changes for them.
Yeah.
I can personally attest to that.
Oh, there's a story here.
Mm-hmm.
Really?
Yeah, 6 years.
Okay.
Didn't die either.
We learn something new every day.
There you go. Okay, we good? All right, so the next item has got two bits to it. Priorities and community quarterly. What do we want to take on first?
I think probably the community quarterly I would offer, is that I think is more timely based on what Paloma sent us, and then priorities we can see what we have energy for after that.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm interested in how we're going to have this conversation. This is, I don't know how, are we going through all of this tonight and figuring out what we want to do?
Every single line. No, I have some thoughts, but we can see when we get to it. But why don't we start with Paloma's, as that sort of has an immediate specific ask.
All right.
Yeah, so I'm sorry, I only sent an updated version of this outline with specific dates right before this meeting. So Ben, maybe if after this meeting you could update what's on the website so the public can view, that would be great. But the only change from our discussion 2 weeks ago was specific proposed dates for the first three quarterlies. And to stay on timeline, I think the two big question marks are if the proposed public forum dates work for at least the majority of council, and if we can find a location, since obviously Tompkins Hose is not a possibility. And then the other question for us to answer is if we're prepared in the workshop meeting tonight to determine our central question around green infrastructure that we'd like the community to answer. So I don't know if folks have a sense of their schedules enough to check those 3 dates, or if we should adjust the calendar.
I will say that the second one falls on Memorial Day weekend, May 27th, so we'd probably want to look for one on a different weekend. I don't know if the one after that would work. Memorial Day is May 29th, and I think you proposed May 27th.
Mm-hmm. I think the other question with cycle 2 is that we were interested in that one coinciding with the recreation and community services ongoing project. Obviously, we just heard from Mark about this intention to revamp and potentially revamp the recreation committee in particular, and potentially start talking to somebody about a feasibility study. I don't know if there needs to be an explicit coordination around those efforts. The sort of idea of the community quarterly is that it's a fairly light touch process, so it doesn't have to be necessarily tied to other specific dates other than our availability to show up to the public forum.
Yeah, I'm wondering for that second one if we could also talk with Mark about what he thinks might be feasible by then. And there might be other topics, particularly as we get into priorities, that kind of bubble up as we have lots of ideas on council and heard lots of other ideas that maybe could also be either 2 or 3 as well, and that might also help determine timing. Was your goal, Paloma, in terms of setting the dates for all 4 cycle, or I guess all 3 cycles, is that you, well, the 4th being the public participation one, with the high schools, that you wanted to publish them all at once?
Yeah, I think not necessarily so much to publish them all as once as to set the dates out there so that we can plan for them.
Is there an open question we're supposed to be answering right now?
No, I didn't.
The open question, 2 open questions. One is, are we okay with these dates? Assuming that we will move the cycle 2 along a week to be able to not have the public forum over Memorial Day weekend, because the next step is to try and book a venue.
Sorry, I don't see the Memorial Day week. Where are the dates in this document?
It's not the one in the.
Sorry,
They were
they're in
emailed to us.
the email.
In your email.
Oh.
Yeah, my only questions are topics, right? The recreation community services, we just, spent a lot of effort to collect 1,000 voices, and I think we've gotten far more than we will be able to get. I just thought that we might want to pick up a different topic.
That
Sure.
makes sense. I don't remember what the objective of that. Was there a narrower scope of that conversation, Paloma? I don't remember. Was it just that it was a way to talk to people to get their ideas?
Yeah, there was the thought, well, the first thought was that it's a topic that we didn't do last year in this format, though of course we did the survey, and that point is well taken. The thought from 2 weeks ago, as I recall, was that it might be a helpful supplement and momentum around recruiting for the whatever the next phases of the development of the facility is, which we only just identified an hour ago, is the revamping of the Recreation Committee. But that does not have to be done in this process, and we can absolutely pick a different topic if we'd like.
Yeah, I'm inclined to look at a different topic. I agree with Lee that we might have gotten everything that we need on that topic.
You know, we can kind of set a calendar without having to pick subjects too, right?
I guess we
Yep.
want the subject for the first one,
Right.
but then, yeah.
I mean, an interesting one that we could include would be when we see the recommendations of the Police Advisory Committee, we could have reopen the discussion about public safety.
Yeah.
So,
Right.
yeah. How about rail trail?
Or,
I mean, trail
Or
and
greenway or
pedestrian
trails in
and,
general?
well, I talked to the Hudson
Stuff.
Highlands Fjord Trail folks, and they're eager to do some public outreach. I was going to suggest Justice and I do something for the neighbors that are down by the river, but we could open it up to be a bigger thing as well.
yeah, that could, and it could be broadened to sort of non-vehicular movement, because there seems to be a lot of different ideas and things we've discussed kind of around that topic, but I like the idea too of focusing it on the trails that are coming.
You know what, I can reach out to Tom Wright and ask him like what kind of conversation he thinks is needed right now, like what he'd like to hear and talk to people about. And Tom always has great insights into this stuff, and he has Greenway Trail. He's excited about all these new connections, so maybe this is a path. Paloma, what do you think of this as a rough concept?
Yeah, is the idea that this would be the focus for this first cycle, or are we brainstorming ideas for the focus for the second cycle?
I think it's to
trying to clarify.
replace rec with talking about trails.
Okay. It's truly up to all of us, so I'm not the deciding factor here by myself.
I like the sound of that, and if anything, we have time to adjust it should we choose. But I think that's a great place to go forward, and then we still also have a third topic to figure out as well. So I'm cool with that.
I will say that does leave a bit of overlap with the initial idea for this first cycle being around climate goals and green infrastructure. Do we have thoughts on how to hone that topic into a central question? Because I'm also happy to say it seems like the topic that there's currently at least the most momentum around is the idea of around trails. And so if we just want to maybe adjust the timeline to give us a little more time to plan and engage on that topic in this first cycle, I think that works too.
I mean, we're asking a broad question for then community members to then go into with more detail and then provide a solution, correct?
Mm-hmm.
I think one of the questions that we could ask, and just thrown past at the wall here, is what community climate initiatives do you think the city could help support? Thoughts?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we can parse the framing of it, but we'll probably get the same proposals.
You know, I like that.
Okay.
So just to restate, it was what community climate initiatives do you think the city could support
Yes.
or should support? Nick will tell us if we can support them or not. Okay, great. So we're going to leave adjust the cycle 2 and potentially the cycle 3 dates, but also leave them loose. And I will plug all of this into our usual materials and see if I can get this out into the world.
Thanks, Paloma. Is there anything more you need from us?
Are there any immediate objections to the date of March 4th in the morning for a public forum date?
That works fine for me.
I have already taken off of work.
Okay.
Great. Thank you all.
Thanks. All right, do you want me to kick this off as I put together the list? So I'm going to start with, for those who are listening in or watching this recording, that in the very end of the packet, there is a list of some of our priorities for the year. So this is something that the City Council and the Administrator have been doing for a number of years, trying to lay out the priorities on a calendar basis. And so we first wanted to share it with all of you. So you're going to see a list. This is a list that I compiled. So part of the discussion that we might engage in tonight is going through this and figuring out, is this the right list? Are these the things on here we actually do want to work on, particularly in this calendar year? Is anything that's missing? And then we may or may not use it as we go through the year, but it's more kind of, the purpose in past years seems to be more about setting our year off right. I know that Chris definitely uses his and reviews them, the City Council kind of off and on, depending on how we feel like it. I might personally review it and go through it and see how we go, but I'll have to follow up and see if you do that. And so I have some ideas about how we could go through it. One other thing, too, to note, if you're looking at the list and going, my goodness, that's a long list of things, it certainly is. I just want to note that there's a bunch of things on here that are capital projects. So these are things that are part of a separate capital project process that we do every year, starting around the end of May. And so that's something, these are projects that either we know are coming up or are ongoing. And then we have what I'll call city operations. So that's stuff that may or may not involve a lot of the involvement of the City Council, but it's something that definitely takes up a lot of Chris's time as the administrator and the heads of department to keep moving forward. And then we have a third category that I will describe as laws, rules, approaches, plans, zoning, and that's really the bread and butter of what the City Council spends a lot of its time doing, and the administrator, and that's probably going to be the main things you already hear us focus on, and we might actually focus on teasing out as part of our priorities in terms of what we think might be coming up in the year. Is there anything generally that the City Council or Chris would add before we kind of dive into what we might want to talk about tonight?
No, I waited till the very end of the process to send you my two ideas, and I sent them today, so you're welcome.
I did. I added those in. I also realized yeah, and I forgot leaf blowers is not on here, so I added that as well.
Okay.
It's something that I know is
sorry,
ongoing.
I was a little out of commission for a couple of weeks, so I'm catching up.
That's all right. Yeah, so I am happy to open it up to the council to, if there's anything, and Chris, if there's anything on here that you want to make sure is added. I actually thought it might be good to almost do the opposite. There's some items that are on here that I wanted to see, is this something that we're feeling like we want to put energy around in 2023, or something that we're like, maybe later, so I want to keep it on there for now, but it might shift. So I'm actually thinking it'd be better to kind of focus on that than focusing on removing of items, but if council members have things they feel they're more keen to talk about, I'm fine with that too.
I mean, one thing that's come into mind is that there's some stuff here that's not, that's not capital and isn't kind of like a core city function, but is in the budget, for example. So the city study for the 25-mile-an-hour speed limit, we included that in the budget last year. So I assume that we're going ahead with that, and I don't know, I don't want to kind of vote on some things a second time, you know. But a lot of this stuff, I don't know, it's hard to, like, there's categories like the fire chief replacement, you know, I would consider that to be something that has to be done, not whether we're choosing whether to do it or not. So, but I could be also, maybe it's just a matter of getting the categories right or changing them a little.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I thought about adding another category, which might not be the best way to go for everyone, but in terms of really delineating what is ongoing or stuff that we know needs to be done versus stuff we have to dig into. Yeah. The 25 mile an hour speed limit one is actually interesting because, and Chris, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but we haven't approved money. We have in our budget, we have money for studies, and we have yet as a council to determine how we want to spend that budget.
I thought we had that conversation and
we said that was one of our priorities, but I don't think we have said, yes, we've authorized the spending of, like we said it's going to be, I think it was $30,000, and yes, we want to do that, but there's a couple of things, like Chris, I think at one meeting mentioned, like there are a handful of things that the council says we probably cannot do them all in 2023, and so which ones do we want to prioritize? Is that an accurate description, Chris?
Yeah, the money is in the budget. We put in $50,000 into the city council line for studies. We would have to go back and figure out which ones you want to do, because right now you have requests for 3. There's the traffic study, which I think was around $15,000. It wasn't as much as we thought. If you want to do a feasibility study, I don't really have a number on that yet. We can try to figure out where that goes. I need to convene with Mark and hopefully a rec committee about what the next steps would be on that. You also have some members of the CAC asking for the open space plan.
Right.
And I've kind of kicked that to later in the year just because we're getting bids out this spring on a lot of projects, and I just didn't have bandwidth to deal with it. So I mean, if again, 50,000 might not be the right number, and maybe we need to tweak that a little bit. We kind of put it in as a placeholder, but it would be helpful to know, like in terms of those and any other studies, what are your priorities for the year? And that's really where it becomes helpful. Like, you know, do you want to do the traffic study first, or do you want to try to start some feasibility study? We might be able to get grant funding if we wait till later in the year for the open space one.
Yeah, I would prefer that we prioritize the traffic study, right? I think we're all heading in that direction, and we should get that done.
Yeah. I know that we're looking at this list and saying, oh my God, how are we going to do all this year? But, you know, a lot of this stuff is not council business. This is Chris's business. And I feel like the stuff that is council business on here is not an unmanageable amount of stuff. I mean, there's some things on here that we haven't talked about in a while, like view sheds, which is a conversation we definitely need to take back up, but, you know.
And historic properties. Like
yeah,
we kind
I
of
had those as two.
We
as
kind
two
of gave up
questions.
on, you set up this HDLO that could float on properties. We did the first round under the last council on Main Street, but we never went beyond that.
We didn't do the off Main
We
Street
haven't done
ones.
any view sheds, so
That's
if, you know, those
Right.
those would be
Like there's
next
just-
logical
Yeah,
steps.
so I had the same kind of look at this as you did, Dan, which is what I tried to say in our email, which is what things that we as a council want to work on, right? Knowing that, you know, the day-to-day operations, and there's a number that are labeled operations, has to get done by the city, and that the capital projects that are teed up have to get executed by the administration, right? Which means, you know, Chris will say, no mas, and, you know, some of that's right. But that means that there are things that we as a council can, you know, can work on, which is typically, you know, some of the things you guys just listed, right? You know, do we pick up parking zoning? Do we pick up HDLO? Do we pick up, you know, those things? I think we should be, right? We had a list from a while ago. the state is now putting out some plans. We should probably start to ask our planner, how do those plans fit with what we're thinking? Does it fit with some of our grants? I think we started some conversations with some of the large affordable, the housing program administrators, and we're starting to look to them to okay, would you like to put something forward? You might need zoning for those. So I think there's a broad category there that we can take on without picking every single item, but rather just saying, let's be looking at that this year.
Mm-hmm.
I think as a council, that's very appropriate, right?
So are there, specifically with HDLO, with the historic district overlay and view sheds, are there things that we think that we might want to pick up this year so they should stay on this list as potential things? Okay.
And it's not a taxing amount of work. I mean, we're talking about view sheds. I think will be harder than HDLO because it's kind of new, right? Like there were already candidate properties off Main Street for the HDLO, and there were candidate sites for view sheds, but I think it didn't really.
I think we picked the sites for view sheds. There were pre-existing ones, the ones facing the Hudson, which came on during our local waterfront revitalization plan. And then I think we identified a few facing the other way, but that's a task where we bring John Clark in and we work with him, right? So that's a resource that we can use without taxing the administration of the city, right? That's, got to work the ops and got to work the major capital projects. So I think that's right. Right.
Speaking of John Clark, we've talked about the sidewalk inventory as well. Is that something that we think we want to at least keep as a possibility? I mean, part of this is, as we know, is yes, we have capacity, but we are all part-time, and Chris is kind of our conduit into getting things to happen and our budget. And so I appreciate that us saying we're interested in this isn't us saying, yes, we're going forth. So it's an ongoing conversation. So it also gives Chris an indication of where it is the city council leaning.
Yeah, I think that we could do, and again, he's going to kick me under the table, but luckily I'm far away.
You're lucky, I'm at a different table.
I think on sidewalks, again, we could ask for some material to be assembled so that by the time that we do our capital planning, we can talk about, okay, right, do we have a piece of our annual capital planning for that, right? So I think we could do that. I think it's a Clark task. Chris, what do you think? Always wants to kick me. Okay.
You're lucky I'm that close. Yeah, I mean, so when I think about sidewalks, I know that in this next year, we're trying to figure out how to rebuild the sidewalks on South Avenue, which is a lot more complex than it originally looked like because we don't own the sidewalks and we have to negotiate an easement. I also think about the fact that I have areas on Main Street that probably really need replacement. So like to start a process where we're going to figure out other new sidewalks to add when we have a bunch of existing sidewalks to do seems a stretch this year with all that we got going.
So what that sounds like, what I hear is that, not that we shouldn't be having the conversation, but we have to remember the items we have to put up sooner rather than later.
I mean, I would like to have a conversation with John about how he would approach that, and maybe he can come to council and say, you already have a sidewalk I mean, you have something on paper that it's an inventory. The inventory isn't so much the issue as the condition, and then how to prioritize where, the $400,000 a year that we've been trying to allocate to sidewalks goes.
Yep. Yep. And I think we could learn from that conversation things like, same with our roads, it's a lot cheaper to mill and pave than it is to build something from scratch. And it could be with sidewalks too, that merely improving the ones that are there, we can get a lot more square footage done than, trying to build from scratch. So maybe that's part of the conversation that we would learn that would help inform us as to how we want to do this, right?
Yeah, I mean, we can have John here to talk about it, to try to figure it out. I just know, like, some members of the council have asked for a sidewalk, like, up on Grove Street, and we've taken a quick look at it, and I don't even, like, without doing a survey, I can't really even put a number on it, but it's really expensive.
Yeah.
Because you have, like, at that site, you have a gabion wall that I think we own. Again, we'd have to have it surveyed. So like what might seem like a smaller project would pull a lot of resources against something that I might think we do earlier on, like repair some of the Main Street sidewalks that are being heaved by the tree roots, like on the east end.
I agree with you generally, Chris. I think the one thing I want to add here is that, you know, those of us who live in the wards and talk to our neighbors, and not that we're more in tune with anyone else, but we are talking to people a lot, and we're not saying that because we talk to folks about the streets and the sidewalks that there's no other valuable opinions, but I think each of us have a strong sense of where the danger spots in our neighborhoods are, and you know, Grove Street, just to use as an example, is yes, it's probably only 50 to 60 feet. It probably would be you know, really expensive. It probably crosses 3 properties and gets really complicated. But it's like the safety of kids, and like you know, like that's something that I think Grove Street, and I think Ren would agree that Grove Street is a priority, and. It's not, I don't want to have a conversation about Grove Street right now. It's just, I just want the council to be respected, and when we're talking about what we think we need in our wards when it comes to sidewalks. And
no,
Main Street
I do,
is
but
for public, but it's, you know, Main Street, you know, when the Main Street sidewalks get fixed, the perception is that that's for the tourists. Obviously, we all live here and we all walk those sidewalks. And people feel like the sidewalks in their neighborhoods are not getting fixed. And
but Dan, I think the challenge is that the sidewalk investments are something you have to do over kind of a long period of time.
I think that's what we're suggesting.
I would start, I think your existing sidewalk inventory is not in very good shape in many areas of the city, and rather than start building new sidewalks, I think there are a lot of areas where we need to make ADA improvements, where we need to go back. Like on Main Street, it is an issue for us, because if somebody trips and falls, we're the first one that they sue. So, and again, I think you can get there over time. It's just, I don't know how we do that. I'm struggling to figure out how I get the ones on South Avenue done, which I need to queue up for the CDBG grant by the end of the year. I need to almost be a year ahead of that. I'm trying to figure out how to do the really bad spots on Main Street. Now, I could go and say to the adjoining landowner, you fix it, and they're going to come back and say, those are your trees that we planted. So again, I want to do the right thing where we fix it, and we, I would love to build sidewalks in many of the neighborhoods, not just Grove, but I mean, we've had people come multiple times. It's just, how do you do it when you know that the cost, like it's only 50 or 60 feet, but you have to do a retaining wall.
Sure, yeah. Well, we can, I mean, I was always thinking the other side of the street where the houses are, but maybe and we can talk about this with John, like maybe what we're saying is, you know, we're spreading it out over years, right? And, you know, we have a 5-year capital plan, and maybe we're saying, okay, we do 3/4 of a mile every year, or we've established like a benchmark. It's like, okay, how do we want to? We have enough money to do 3/4 of a mile. Where do we want those 3/4 of a mile this year to go? Like we do milling and paving. Where are the sidewalks? And that could alternate between repair of sidewalk and maybe installation of new sidewalk where there's maybe an explicit safety issue. You know, so maybe we set some criteria for how much we get done each year, and then we also have some criteria for like how we choose the projects. Because I'm certainly not proposing millions and millions of dollars of sidewalk while you're already working on other ones, you know.
And know that I don't disagree that I'd love to put a sidewalk there and many of the other places that people have said that. Ideally, you want to extend those sidewalks throughout the city. At least one, you know, particularly in areas where on routes to school. Maybe John can help us figure out how to prioritize, though, and figure out that criteria.
Well, again, I think that is where we can go. I think we need to be mindful that, you know, a mile of road is at least 20 times more expensive than milling and paving an existing road. And I'm guessing that sidewalks will be the same, right? That new is a whole, you know, quantum more than just fixing or supporting. But let's see that, right?
And,
What we have to
and
do
again, I
is
think
learn what the lay of the land
depends
is.
too. Like these ones on South Avenue, I'm finding out might be more expensive than we ever thought.
Yeah.
And we might say, okay, maybe we'd go to Wolcott and do those. I only just learned today that we don't own those. We don't own the sidewalk. So part of it, as you figure out what you're able to do within the time limits that you have.
Right, and the other piece of the puzzle we'll also have to talk about is how it's financed. Remember that currently, if we're doing a whole, it varies what we're doing as to who bears responsibility. I don't recall exactly what that is, but
Yeah, the
we should
city-
learn that as a council and bring that into our consideration, right?
And we started that conversation last year. We had Nick talk about who owns what, and mostly it's the adjoining landowner that's responsible for replacing. When we do whole replacements of roads, then we can take that on, like we're doing with Fishkill-Teller Avenue.
So, rather than have as the goal, I have, this particular place, that I know needs blank, that we really focus on the process and, the information that we need to collect and to understand, and then to be able to establish kind of a cadence and a process without necessarily saying, I'm trying to get this particular one done.
And
Right.
and I do want to set some context. We're spending a lot of time on Fishkill and Teller Avenue. I've spent a lot of time the last 2 years. That's 1.9 miles. So if you add up all of the existing sidewalks there, you're probably around 3 miles, because it's not a complete sidewalk system. It's probably somewhere between 2.5 to 3 miles of new sidewalk that we're going to start doing in the spring. That's a pretty big jump from where we've been before. So, again, I know I keep going back to that. That was a 20-year project. We got it to bid, and again, it's going to be one of the biggest investments that we make as a city in sidewalks in years.
Great.
Yeah,
I'm going
pretty
to
psyched
intervene
about it.
and say this is a fabulous conversation, and also I think this is a great example of how we can think of this moving forward. So one of the values of this list is we can say, hey, we haven't talked about this, like housing, which we shouldn't talk about tonight, just to be clear. Yeah, so sidewalks stay on the list. So I think for that, we can return to we had this conversation, but we haven't made any decisions, haven't talked about when we want to bring John Clark in, so maybe in a month, it comes back as can we schedule this out? So with that in mind, I want to just go through a couple other items on the list and just see if we want to keep them or remove them, knowing that there might be some that we're yes, because I have deep, very specific thoughts about them. Is that all right? I don't
Can I
want to
make
cut
one
the
other
conversation.
At the
Yes.
end, can I make one additional suggestion? about
Yes, and
this?
you can make additions as we go through too as well. And I have a question kind of for Nick and the group just about kind of continuing to share this with the
And,
public.
and just a quick thing on your 2023 status, it doesn't look like the information that I gave you got onto this new, because you have a lot of things that aren't started yet that are well under progress.
Oh,
So
okay.
I think when we went through that spreadsheet, I gave you some information that maybe didn't get on here.
Oh, it's funny. I went through and changed it all. Yeah, if you have, yes, you and I can connect and I can update it.
Thanks.
And make sure that it's there. Sorry about that. We had a category called communications strategy. It's kind of very broad, and I just wanted to see if anyone on council is feeling energy around looking into that, about what we want to do around that.
Not right now, but I want to bring it up again at budget time, the possibility of doing targeted mailers around specific issues.
Okay.
Something I brought up before, and I still think there's still merit to that.
Great. Land acknowledgement, Paloma, I know something you and I were working on, and specifically around trying to do something this year. Is this something that you want to try to look into, and to anyone else on council? I only call out Paloma and myself as we specifically have talked about it before.
Yeah, I don't have, it's a personal priority, but I don't necessarily see it reflected in the priorities of the council overall, so I don't need to see it on this list.
Great, thank you. All right. Support federal, state, and county legislation was its own line. Is there anything in particular, or I can remove it as its own line? It might get incorporated into other items as we go through. I just didn't know if there's anything particular that people are already thinking about. No.
Kind of an open-ended one, I think.
All right. I'm going to look at those. Look at this. You see, I like making the list shorter as well as add more notes. Climate and environmental priorities. There are a whole bunch of things that came up. It's sort of going to be a topic for our community quarterly, so I just wanted to see if there's anything in particular that any of the council wanted to make sure is captured for something specific we're thinking about for 2023.
So I think we're picking up the right one, right? Which is, our building code.
Right.
All right, because I don't think you can pick them all up. I think I'm really glad we've done composting. If we take our eye off that ball, I think we'll lose value. So I think we have to keep on that. So I would just pick fewer things rather than try to pick them all. We pick them all, we're not going to do anything well.
Dan, I know you brought up stuff around Fishkill Creek watershed before. Is that something you're hoping to keep going, the conversation this year?
Yeah, we're just waiting to hear back from Nick on what the what some of the other municipalities in New York State are doing to protect their waterways and wetlands at the city level.
Great. State climate goals, in addition to what we're doing electrification, was there anything else around state climate goals that we're aware of that we specifically want to work towards this year?
Well, you're going to finish your leaf blower law at some point. I think we were trying to bring that back in March. We were trying to get through the rec study and the electrification law, and then get back to that too.
Great. Good. Main Street green space. This is something we want. It's a recommendation from the Main Street Access Committee, which I know we are talking about their recommendations as a whole separately. Is there anything we want to, as a council, kind of talk specifically about the idea of adding green space to Main Street and where that might be in this coming calendar year?
So I think you need to wait for the Main Street Access Report. It's going to be divided into, and we're already implementing some of the short-term things, so that just becomes part of the operational activities of the city. The parks, actually, that's not a recommendation that was initiated by that group. It's in our comprehensive plan.
Yeah.
Right? If we want to do that, that's going to take a couple of years of planning to lay out. Even if we just pick one of those to pursue, that's a planning issue. So that has a kind of a medium-term time frame. We can talk about that. I think maybe one way to do that is to talk about with Clark what are sort of planning, and zoning things that we want to work on. If we want to do that, again, it's not something you do in, a 6-month period. It takes some period of time.
Okay. So we might do something like consider selecting a space, or the criteria for selecting a space this year?
Right, or you do that, or some of it is something that comes along, what's the word, opportunistically, right? Like
a piece of land comes up for sale that might make a nice park.
Yeah.
We do have our eyes on that.
Right, or, the county says, I'm ready to exit the building, or, things like that. And so they may not be things that we choose that way.
Right. That choose us.
But I think that once we get the Main Street Access Committee, it'll divide into, okay, these will take on operationally. Then the question becomes, what do you want to do with the rest? The one thing you do is you stick them in the comprehensive plan, but then you ask the question, is there some piece of this that I want to pursue? That becomes a project, right, that you've got to get resourced for.
Renter info on city website. I think this is when we were talking about good cause and wanting to do more of this. Is this something where any members of council are feeling some interest in getting additional information on our website for renters, for landlords?
I think it would be helpful, but not as helpful as Know Your Rights events, which is something that I don't know is within the capacity of the city to take on, but is certainly a personal priority.
Okay. All right, I'll leave it on for now, Paloma, knowing that might something you and others might explore separately that may or may not become a full county thing, a full council thing. Thank you.
Along those lines, I think Two, we'll need to have a discussion regarding good cause eviction, given that fact that it's in 2 municipalities it's been struck down, and I think we'll have to face a decision as to where we want to go with that.
I think the Court of Appeals will make the decision for us.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
we don't have to. We can wait till we get sued.
Well, isn't it in our legislation to revisit the effect of the law later this year?
I was going to follow up with that. I think that's the next step is what we do. And also see what kind of usage the legal aid has gotten in the courts, and if it's actually diminished potential evictions.
Great, thank you.
I can say anecdotally, it definitely has, but I appreciate wanting to do a comprehensive review.
Revised seeker requirements, the state environmental quality review requirements. This was on here. I don't know if it's something we already did or something we had to address in 2023.
So that's in the package of material to facilitate housing construction.
Okay.
Right? And so we stick it with here's the, that should be part of zoning efforts, right?
Okay.
Because simplifying seeker, simplifying our parking requirements, those are steps in that kind of enabling, housing construction.
Great. Thank you. And then, I just wanted to check with the trail stuff. So we talked about the Greenway Trail. We've talked about the rail trail that the county is running. And it sounds like you had a meeting with Fjord Trail, Dan, recently. I just didn't know if there's anything else related to trails that we wanted to capture separately on here, like if the shuttle for the Fjord Trail or something else the city wants to get involved in. If we're having discussions about the Tiranda Bridge this year, or again, that's waiting until a later year we find out more about the Fjord Trail.
The Tiranda Bridge is on a pretty long deadline. I mean, it's kind of the end of their plan.
Yeah.
Making progress on that bridge is a priority of mine. It's definitely it's been a priority of Lee's for many years. But I think we're in kind of we have to work through this.
Okay, great. And then lastly, I have sort of two that I kind of connected, sort of a social service inventory and service communications. Actually, based on our conversation earlier with Mark, this might be something the rec committee could in its future iteration take on, but I just wanted to see if it's something that we should keep on our priorities list for now.
I would like to keep it on the priorities list. If we're talking about communications, I think this is one of the most important things that we can be communicating. But I also agree with you, as Mark shared with us, he's sort of already doing this, being a dispatcher for service needs, and so giving his department more support to do that is, I think, the long-term solution.
Great. All right, so that is everything I just wanted to review and just make sure that I'm thinking about. Is there anything else people wanted to add that is not already on the list, that has not already been discussed? Are the items, or making sure that I'm updating it with information you're giving me? In that case, yeah, I will take a look at this and bring it back, and then I will talk, Chris and Nick, maybe with you, just about sharing this with the public ongoing if we want to do that, and what kind of information we want to include. We don't necessarily have to discuss it every time, but just as a way to keep them up to date if that's in a packet or on the website or whatever, wherever ends up making sense. So,
Molly, you
yeah.
said you in the newest draft, you included the public benefits and the park fees?
Yes, so if you just want to, actually, why don't you say just a minute more about those out loud, as that's
so
not
just
in the public record.
a review of when and where we require public benefits as part of new construction, and just kind of reassess and see if we want to do more. And then the other thing is to reassess our park fees for new construction, when there's fees for projects where the building or the property won't be able to provide adequate recreational space for the people who live there, I think is the logic behind the fees. And I don't think we talked about it a couple of years ago in the last council, coming back to it, but we never really did. So I think, and it might be a short conversation.
Okay. All right. Great.
And I also just wanted to suggest that at the end of workshop meetings, we just take 5 minutes to assess, to just talk about what's next. We used to do these before COVID, the short 2 months.
Yeah.
We'd meet in your office after meetings to talk about upcoming workshop. Maybe we could have a short public version of that.
Yeah, we
Or-
can do something,
Yeah.
right? Yeah, I'd forgotten about those.
Yeah,
It's like the pre-COVID world.
I always
right?
took you up on it.
I know, so.
Great. Yeah, I'll just finish off by saying we have actually, probably have other complete items on here, as Chris said, but one that caught my eye was we had our HR director wanted to form a safety committee, and she's actually already formed it amongst our city employees, so that's going to be an ongoing thing that she's working on, but I marked it complete on here. She already got it up and running, and there's some things they've been able to do, so that's a great win for our city. All right, I'll pass it back to you, Lee.
Are we ready for a motion to adjourn? What do you all
Motion.
think?
Motion to adjourn?
Second.
All right. All in favor?
Hi.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
All right. I appreciate all
Bye.
the effort. This was a good conversation.
Paloma.